Good morning, everybody, or good afternoon, depending on where you are in the world. Thank you for joining us at another session of Discovery. My name is Alison Moskowitz, and I'm the Director of Engagement at Efficiency Canada. Efficiency Canada operates within Carleton University, and we acknowledge that the location of our campus sits on the traditional unceded territories of the Algonquin Nation. In doing so, we also acknowledge that we have a responsibility to the Algonquin people and a responsibility to adhere to Algonquin cultural protocols. For those of you joining us for the first time, Efficiency Canada hosts discovery sessions every 2 weeks. The sessions are really meant to bring together the sector, people interested in energy efficiency, to learn together. We try to highlight new research, findings from pilots, relevant topics, and innovations that are happening across the sector. Before we get started, just a reminder that there is a question and answer button at the bottom of your screen. You can use that to ask questions throughout the presentation, though the question and answer period will be at the end. I also wanted to mention that there is a closed captioning function as well. If there is a language that you're more comfortable communicating in or receiving information in, you can actually set that closed captioning to whatever language that you're comfortable in. With that, I will introduce Kai. Kai Millyard is with us today from Green Communities Canada. He's going to explore the findings of their newest report called Retrofitting Canada's Homes, Progress Report Number 1. He's going to outline some of the first years of the Greener Homes Grant Program, successes, where it can improve, as well as some examples that Canada should learn from. So with that, Kai, welcome and over to you.
Well, thank you for the introduction, Alison, and for the opportunity to share this work with everybody. I'm Kai Millyard. I'm with Green Communities Canada. I am both a consultant, have been a climate and energy policy consultant for a long time, and I run the EnerGuide service organization at Green Communities Canada. We are the longest operating EnerGuide service organization in Canada, and so I'm wearing two hats here. And let's get into it. So Green Communities Canada is an association of not-for-profit organizations operating all across the country. In Ontario, we work with member organizations delivering EnerGuide services. We also have a special program to support deep energy retrofitting, which we launched in 2020 to provide resources, training, research in support of ambitious, widespread, and equitable retrofits, which is what's going to be needed to get the job done. We all know what the task is. We have lots of houses in this country. Just about all of them will have to be retrofitted to some extent. Where are we at? Well, greenhouse gas emissions are going down in the low-rise building sector, but very slowly, 6% since 2005. To get to net zero in this sector, we would need to be going at about 4% every year, which is about 10 times faster than they have been coming down. In order to deal with that, we thought, well, let's take stock. Let's see how much retrofitting is getting done. A lot of retrofitting in this country gets documented by the EnerGuide rating system. Many residential retrofit programs use an EnerGuide audit before and afterwards to make recommendations and measure the impacts of improving insulation and so on. So we got the documentation for all of the 188,000 retrofits that were completed in the 3-year period, 2020 to 2022. And this is what we learned. So this window is a good window for understanding the impact of the Greener Homes Grants program, because the first year had no Greener Homes program. The retrofits there were from regional incentive programs, some provincial programs, some municipal programs. It was in the middle of 2021 and May when Greener Homes was introduced, was launched. Most of the audits and the programming happening in 2021, therefore, was people getting their initial energy audit and starting to do their work, but not a lot of retrofits were finished in that first 6 months. But then obviously the third year, Greener Homes was in full swing and lots of retrofits were getting finished. And you can see the impact. It was obviously very successful. I don't know if any of you remember, but when the program was introduced, the federal government's website nearly crashed. The number of people enrolling in the first few days was wildly beyond expectations. And there was so much more demand than the EnerGuide service organizations could help with. The EnerCan put up extra money to train more auditors in the first couple of years and so on. Okay, well, what was the actual plan for Greener's Homes? The budget was expecting to do 100,000 retrofits in each of 7 years, $2.6 billion budget. you'd need to be going about 4 times faster than that rate to run through just about all of the housing stock by 2050. You would also need to eliminate all the greenhouse gases. So it's both a function of how many houses are you doing and how deep are the savings. Well, this is how deep the savings are. And as it turns out, in the year before greener homes, the average energy savings were 17%. When greener homes was fully rolling, the average savings didn't go up much. They were 21%. And the orange bar is the greenhouse gases. So we were doing a lot more retrofits, but not much deeper retrofits. Okay, well, what do we need to do? Well, we need to do deep retrofits. And we define a deep retrofit as a retrofit that produces a 50% savings in total energy use or more. And here's what we saw. In 2020, only 1.5% of the retrofits were deep. And by the time Greener Homes was fully rolling, it was up to 6%. So that's good news, although obviously they all need to be deep to get there. The main reason for the growth of deep retrofits was the extra incentives for heat pumps and solar. Most efficiency programs, most residential retrofit programs have focused on the building shell, insulation and windows and draft proofing. And so heat pumps and solar, certainly on a national scale, was new, and it made a difference. And here's the difference it made in actual savings. Now, this is expressed in terms of greenhouse gases, not energy, but it was an enormous difference. It was 2.5 to 3 times higher than the average retrofits. And you might say, well, that's not eliminating the greenhouse gases, but in most of those houses, there is still fossil fuel being used. There may still be a natural gas furnace or hot water heater. And eventually that equipment is going to be phased out and replaced with heat pumps. And the remaining carbon that's in those deeply retrofitted houses is just part of the carbon that's in the electricity in those provinces. And of course, there's a separate plan to be phasing that down as well. So we talk about deep retrofitting as having 3 steps. The most important is the big efficiency step at the beginning, the building envelope first. Improve the efficiency of the building so it uses less energy, period. 2/3 of the energy used in houses in Canada is for space heating. So it's the first place to go, improving the building envelope. Then when you need to be replacing mechanical equipment, you can get smaller units, cheaper units, better sized. They tend to work better when they're smaller. And then with the small remaining amount of energy used in the house, you can add renewables, which it's very difficult to get to a net zero house from an existing house. You can do it, and some people do, but many of them are not going to. We simply don't all have enough roof space for that much PV. If you don't do the building envelope first, there can be difficulty when you get to putting in heat pumps. First of all, they're simply bigger and more expensive than is strictly necessary. There are some problems with undersized ductwork. The backup system to the heat pump, which is much less efficient than the heat pump, will run a lot more. You get lower efficiency, you don't get the savings and the greenhouse gas reductions that you want. And you may have to upgrade the power supply to the house. That can be a limitation on being able to even put in a heat pump, because many of those, of course, were only installed on the assumption that they were supporting lights and appliances, but not that the electric capacity had to support all the energy use in the house, which we're now expecting. It depends on how the contractor does it, but heat pumps may end up being noisier. They can fail sooner if they are too big. The other big consequence is simply that if we just think we're going to try and fuel switch everything to electricity without improving efficiency, is we're going to have much higher electric demand growth than we would if we did it efficiently. About 20% of the energy in the country is consumed in the form of electricity now. And as you all know, electrification is a primary strategy for decarbonizing the energy system. But that's a huge shift from electricity off fossil fuels to providing almost all the energy in the country with electricity. And we're imagining doing this over the next 25 years. The Canadian Climate Institute estimated this would require 2 to 3.5 times as much electric capacity in the country as we have now. To do that, it would require accelerating the growth rate of our electric systems by about 3 times over the rate that we've built those electric systems over the last century. Given that a lot of that electricity would be going towards space heating, which is a surprisingly space and water heating, which is a large fraction of national energy needs. If you can halve the heating needs, you will have the electric generation needs as well. It's enormously expensive to build out an electrical system like this. You've seen some of the headlines with some provinces announcing their plans to expand their electric systems in the next few decades in response to this. Okay, now we're jumping back to deep retrofit savings to understand more about what's happening there. We're getting a lot more heat pumps and a lot more solar. 40% of the participants in greener homes got a heat pump in 2022. But among the deep retrofitting folks, 57% of those people got a heat pump. Of the average retrofits, 6% did solar, but among the deep retrofits, 26% of them did solar. These two measures produce large chunks of savings. So they are responsible for most of the boosting of the savings that make them get over 50% savings. Well, then we asked, with these extra savings coming into the program, why aren't average savings growing more than they are? Remember, they only went from 17 to 23% with the program being introduced. Well, as it turns out, it's because the third piece, the building efficiency piece, isn't happening. In fact, it's declining significantly. You can see here, this is the green bar is the average of all retrofits. To what extent are we reducing the heat losses in the buildings with building envelope efficiency work? And you can see that it's declined from 11% before the program to 8.5% after the program. I've done some quick work on our own data for 2023, and it's gone down even more in 2023. And among the deep retrofits, before greener homes started, people doing deep retrofits were reducing their heat losses by almost half on average. And now they're only doing 12% reduction in their heat losses. It's an enormous decline. And the obvious question is, well, why? Well, the incentive is $5,000 that Greener Homes offers homeowners. That's the same rebate as the previous version of this program that started 20 years ago had. That's only worth $3,250 now with inflation. But retrofits are expensive. Heat pumps cost $5,000 to $25,000. PV can easily be $25,000, depending on how old and inefficient your house is. Redoing the building envelope, insulating it, and draft sealing it, and windows and so on can be $100,000. And yet a single upgrade within the Greener Homes incentive schedule, there are 4 different individual incentives where you can get the whole $5,000 just from doing your walls, or just from doing a solar system, or just from doing a heat pump. Once you've done one of those things, that's it. And yet almost all houses need significantly more than one thing. So homeowners can't do everything. There's just not enough incentive to help them to do everything. And what they're choosing is solar systems and heat pumps, and they're backing away from envelope upgrades where more of that was done in the past. In other words, the $5,000 cap is constraining the program's success. So another aspect of the program that is in fact missing is an EnerGuide can provide advice, and it does at the beginning, but it's not structured to provide ongoing help for homeowners. Hassle costs in doing a retrofit are significant for homeowners. The job of doing the research, collecting quotes, selecting contractors, getting permits, managing the project, and so on. Some people are very comfortable doing this, others aren't, but it's a significant commitment of time and effort either way. So we end up with some people doing do-it-yourself work. People do piecemeal retrofits, which is to say little bits and pieces at a time rather than thinking through a whole integrated retrofit. And of course, there's poor contractor work that gets done as well. We see this all the time when we go back for a post-retrofit audit, and that results in lower savings. People miss the rebates they were after because something was done poorly. So services are starting up. Various people are trying energy coaching and concierge services in various places to try and help homeowners with this. It makes a difference. This has been measured. It helps. It does help get better retrofits, and it should be available to everybody, and it should be included as part of the incentives in incentive programs. Well, what do other programs look like? Well, in Germany, you can get a loan of up to $210,000. Depending on how much you improve the efficiency of your building on their home energy rating scale, they will forgive up to $50,000 of that loan. Now, that's a serious incentive. That performance-based aspect of the incentive is a valuable one. It helps people focus on what gets the big results rather than just looking at a sort of a restaurant menu full of 5 different things you should do in your house and they pick 1 or 2 of them, but they don't think of it as an overall project. Yes, in other words, a performance-based incentive promotes deep retrofits. Their program requires an energy expert or concierge kind of service, which is covered in incentives. Another example comes from Ireland, where they have a program called the One Stop Shop program. Theirs looks more like Greener Homes with a list of rebates for all the different measures in the house. They have no maximum amount listed in their program, but if you were to draw all of it, it would be about $50,000 as well. They've been paying $34,000 on average. Again, it requires reaching a high rating on their home energy rating scale. This is really a program for people doing deep retrofits. Can't participate if it's going to be a superficial project in this case. Incentives cover the professional help. They offer the homeowner 2 ratings, managing the retrofit, the general contracting, grant processing, the whole thing. There are some local experiments with including some performance-based incentives. In the Arctic, you can get it. In Manitoba, in Kingston, Ontario, their local program has performance-based incentive included. We have recommended, when this report was released in early November, that to align the Greener Homes program with Canada's greenhouse gas reduction goals, deep retrofits should be adopted as the goal for the program, and it should be redesigned accordingly. The messaging would have to be redesigned, and the way you would redesign the incentives themselves is significantly increase the maximum incentive, include a performance pay incentive scaled to the level of savings achieved, and include the costs of expert help in planning and carrying out the retrofit in the incentive. The EnerGuide service organizations may need to provide more training to support deeper retrofitting to some of their advisors. There are certainly some out there that can and do it, but not across the board. And then we had one recommendation to help accelerate the transition to heat pumps, which was mostly to provincial governments to phase out fossil fuel equipment in new construction as soon as possible. This is on the horizon with the BC Step Code, of course, but not everybody has committed to that yet. And it's a measure that could be taken sooner in other provinces, even without having adopted the whole Step Code. And that was my presentation for this report that was released on November the 8th. And on November the 9th, we, EnerGuide service organizations, were in our regular bi-weekly meeting with Natural Resources Canada. And they told us that Greener Homes was so successful that they will be closing the program, which surprised everybody. And as you may know, that happened this week. They thought they might have enough money to carry us through and keep enrolling people until March. But as often happens, when you know the door is closing, you get a rush of more applicants, and they've had to close the program this week. It's already closed in Ontario, and that's happening over the next couple of weeks in the rest of the country. There is a new program being designed. It will be targeted to lower income households, but it will not include EnerGuides necessarily. It will be administered locally. There are already provincial and some utility programs that are doing low-income programming, and it's my view that federal money will enhance those programs regionally and then require startup of programs and be able to fund startup of programs in provinces that don't have anything. But what this means is that EnerGuide service organizations are in a terrible situation right now because the vast majority of their business has just disappeared. And given that just 2 years ago, there was a panic to expand and train new people, Enercan put new money in to do that, it's a very hard 180-degree turnaround to understand. And of course, simply from the perspective of meeting Canada's greenhouse gas reduction goals, it doesn't make any sense. We've all supported the need for low-income programs to be added because that sector simply can't participate in a program that has a partial rebate. But what looks like what they're doing is abandoning 2/3 of Canadians in order to provide a program for low-income Canadians. Watch for our progress report number 2 We just obtained the data and have started analyzing it.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Kai. As you were speaking, I'm not sure you saw the comments coming in, but everybody was so impressed with the data and appreciative that your organization had put this together. It's really helpful and useful information. So I'll just say that on behalf of everybody attending. We have some great questions in the question and answer box right now. So I encourage you to ask your questions below. And if you scroll up and you see a question that you want answered, you can also like it and it upvotes that question. With that, I'm going to start really basic because we do have some people on the line that are newer to energy efficiency and don't really know the sector well. So can you, when you talk about building envelope, can you just talk about what that means?
Sure. So it starts with that. At one point, I mentioned the pie chart of how we use energy in a house in Canada. And on average, 2/3 of the energy used in a house is simply for space heating. Maybe 15 or 20% of the energy is used for water heating. A surprisingly small fraction is used for air conditioning. It's maybe 3% of the total. And then lights and appliances use the rest. And that's another 10 or maybe 15%. When we talk about the building envelope, it means it means the thermal shell or the outside of our building that keeps the heat in. You improve that by insulating the attic, the walls, the basement, by having better windows, and by reducing uncontrolled air leakage. Those are the building envelope improvement measures.
Thank you. I appreciate that. And so a bit of a follow-up question on that. This one's about heat pumps. We can see how many heat pumps were installed and what the focus really was of those incentives from your presentation. There's a question about heat pumps failing if they're too big. And just wondering if you could elaborate on that a little bit from somebody that has just installed a heat pump.
Yes. Well, don't worry. There's a good chance that your heat pump is actually too small rather than too big. Heat pumps have been around for a long time. We all have them. Your refrigerator is a heat pump. Your air conditioner is a heat pump. It's just a device that moves heat from one place to another. And we're now suddenly starting to use them in a big way to move heat from outdoors to indoors. It's almost exactly like a central air conditioner, except running in the other direction. But they're more complicated than furnaces and boilers. They almost always work together with a backup heating system. This is not because heat pumps are not up to the job. There's a number of reasons for this. They don't have to be designed like that in new construction, for example. When you're designing the ductwork and the whole building and the heating system at the same time, the heat pump can heat the whole house. Old ductwork systems that we have in all of our existing old houses were designed to use a much higher temperature air, which old inefficient heating systems used to produce. Efficient new heating systems, and this is especially true with heat pumps, produce lower temperature heated air. So it means that they have to run for a longer stretch during the hour in order to satisfy the thermostat and keep the house warm. But guess what? The ductwork is often so limited when you're retrofitting to a heat pump that the heat pump can produce enough heat, but the ductwork is a constraint in terms of getting the heat out to all the rooms to satisfy the thermostat. So we always have to install them smaller than the full heating requirement of the building. And so you have your old furnace or you have an electric backup heater inside the heat pump that can turn on the juice and pick up that coldest weather stretch by raising the temperature in the ducts. Again, it's not because the heat pump couldn't produce enough heat. It's because of this constraint in the ductwork. The heating dealers aren't really up to speed on these. They're more complicated. This process of analyzing what the ductwork can do, they don't do that. And what they've been doing is just selling people small heat pumps because it won't run into the risk of having too big a heat pump. They're also expensive. And so it's easier for them to make a sale for a $12,000 heat pump than a $16,000 heat pump. We've actually just launched a research project on exactly this question. How can we work with the heating industry to ensure that they are sized properly? Now, you're going to have to remind me whether I've in fact answered your question.
That was very comprehensive. Thank you. Yeah, and I think it's interesting. You've highlighted one of the things that I'm hearing from a lot of associations, either trade associations or industry, is like the training is just not up to snuff right now. So excited to see that report. Okay, so there's been a couple questions in here about regional data. So just curious if you were able in your research to find regional uptake for certain pieces, where if it was concentrated in certain parts of the country or was it across the board?
So I prepared a lot of that data. It's all there. It's an incredibly rich database. I have all kinds of graphs that break out all these results by province, which we decided in the end not to put in the initial report. We had some broad points we wanted to make about the national picture, and we said, it's okay, we can do some of this regional analysis later. And there are some extremely interesting differences. For example, in the penetration of solar or heat pumps, or who's doing more deep retrofits than others. On the coasts in British Columbia and in Atlantic Canada, you have much higher penetration of heat pumps than you do in Ontario, and particularly on the prairies where it's very close to zero. There's a number of reasons for this. First of all, in BC, you've got relatively clean electricity, so there's been great enthusiasm for electrification there. And there's a lot of interest in air conditioning, growing interest in air conditioning in BC, and heat pumps, of course, provide heat and air conditioning. In Atlantic Canada, there's not much natural gas. So they're using much more expensive heating fuels like propane and oil and electricity. And so the straight financial case for going to a heat pump, which is 3 times as efficient as those others, is enormous. And so there have been regional incentive programs there, sponsored by Nova Scotia government and so on, which have resulted in a much higher penetration of heat pumps. We haven't decided yet what the contents of our next report is going to be, although we're hoping to produce it very quickly now over the next month. And we'll see. Other messages may be more important than regional breakdowns. We may simply include some of the regional breakdown graphs in an appendix or something like that. But there's a lot to learn about differences across the country. It really reinforced how there are significant differences across the country, and the way you design programs has to take that into account.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think the follow-up question that I would like to add is, was there any information, and I think a lot of people have had a lot of trouble finding this data in terms of the segments of Canadians that have taken advantage of this program?
No.
Oh, interesting.
This data is done on the energy audit. It's about the measurements of the building and the R values and the efficiency of the heating system. It's not about the families, that decided to participate in the program.
Needing to know the necessity of the buildings that needed this work.
Well, so I've been doing these kinds of programs for decades, and we thought that there may be a difference in greener homes from some of these older programs. Programs that focus on the thermal envelope, the building shell, insulation programs, they are more interested in the older, really inefficient buildings, obviously, because that's where the biggest savings are. When we've been doing those kinds of programs, we'll occasionally get somebody in a 10-year-old house that will call us up and want to participate. And we'll say, well, sure, we'd love to come out and look at your house. But we already know that the building shell, because it was built with a relatively strong building code only 10 years ago, is going to be quite well insulated already. There's not going to be much potential to add insulation. You can certainly spend lots of money and replace windows and get higher end windows, but that's among the last thing that we recommend to people, because windows are very expensive. And the amount of savings you get from replacing windows is actually pretty small. But when this program appeared, and it includes heat pumps and it includes solar, well, those aren't aimed at old houses. Those are equally useful in new houses. In fact, if you already have an efficient building shell because your house was built 10 or 20 years ago, then the heat pumps and the solar are the last thing to do in order to finish your deep retrofit. And so we expected that maybe we'd get a younger average house participating. We do track the age of when the houses were built. And surprisingly, that didn't change. Yeah, the average age of houses participating is mid-1960s. Yeah.
That's really interesting. That would be really great to see in your next report if we can make suggestions. The next question is about storage capacity. This is such a cool question. Would there be benefits to incentives for electricity storage capacity at individual homes to support renewable electricity use in off-peak hours?
Yes, absolutely. And in fact, the Greener Homes program does have an incentive for a storage battery. I think it's $1,000. There's a specification for how big that battery has to be. It's often done when people are putting in a PV system, of course. Although, if you haven't had your initial audit, that's no longer available to you.
Okay. There's a question about incentives for landlords and how that was treated in this program versus how it should be treated. So I wonder if you want to comment on that.
Sure. So the Greener Homes program itself, sponsored by NRCan, took a narrower targeting and said, this program is only for owner-occupied houses. Said, we're not going to do cottages, and it's not for landlords. We're not going to do rented buildings this time. Past programs of this kind have included landlords, and some of the utility programs do. And a year ago, you may be aware, if you live in Ontario, for example, that Enbridge Gas has had its own program of this kind running. And for a year there, we had both the Greener Homes program and the Enbridge program, which wasn't great. It would confuse the marketplace. And so they integrated the two programs. Well, Enbridge's program didn't have a problem with landlords. It was available to landlords. And it's really important to have programs for landlords because they don't have a big incentive to participate in these kinds of things, because oftentimes it's the tenants that are paying the bill. And you have the classic energy efficiency program design problem, which is called the split incentive, where it's the landlord that makes the capital investment decisions about the building. No tenant is going to spend capital improving the landlord's building. On the other hand, it's the tenant that suffers the operating cost. And yet the landlord has no incentive to improve the building because they won't get the benefit. And it's usually very generous incentives to help the landlord pay for the cost of the upgrade that can overcome that split incentive. This time, Greener Homes said, no, we're not going to do landlords for some reason. But if you were in Ontario and you were heated by gas, in that case, you were able to do it. Different programs will start with the easy chunks that you can address, and sometimes they'll expand the eligibility into sectors that are harder to reach and have some other program features to try and address those other segments. But you can't always do everything for everybody under one umbrella.
So I think this is a really great follow-up question to what you were just talking about. Were there any learnings from this Greener Homes program that you could suggest, maybe in new programs that the provinces and utilities could better leverage successes that we have had from this program? Yeah, I'd love your comment on that.
Yeah, well, there are a number. One thing that Greener Homes did that many people have commented on is that it was too complicated. Administratively, it was too complicated. They required homeowners to have their first point of participation by going to the federal Greener Homes website and enrolling in the program online. And that ended up being a complicated process. And not all homeowners still, in this day and age, are really comfortable or really good at that kind of thing. And it was just complicated. Most of these programs in the past have simply required that you contact a delivery agent, in this kind of case, an EnerGuide service organization that says, yes, we will just take care of all of that for you. We'll book your audit for next week and we'll send it all in. In fact, at the end, when Enercan was telling us they were going to close the program, they said, yeah, we've learned one thing, make it simpler. Don't forget that. So that's one thing. So many other recommendations were directly addressing this. It had very ambitious goals, and the individual incentives were much more generous than in the past, and they were getting significant enough to persuade people to do things. But if you have a cap on the whole thing, which is so small that they just can't do it all, then you've shot yourself in the foot. So that's another issue.
Yeah, and we hear this from provincial programs as well. And I think there is an interest in looking at how incentives can be structured to provide deeper retrofit. I think this is something that all programs need to look at, whether it's federal or jurisdictional or provincial.
Sure.
How are we doing that? It can't just be these sort of light incentives you're talking about that are the easy to do, cheaper to do.
Well, and I come back to my performance-based incentive, where you scale the incentive to the amount of savings that people produce. The very first EnerGuide incentive program started in 2003, and it was exclusively that kind of incentive design. The rating system at that time was different. It was a score for your house was on a 1 to 100 scale, and 100 was like 100% on a test, and 0 was like a test score. And the incentive was literally just, I think it was $50 for every point that you improved your rating on the scale. So it was very straightforward. And in fact, that program produced higher savings than the one that started some years later called Eco Energy, which reverted away from that and went to this rebates for individual upgrades and approach. I still think that performance-based incentive is a very important message to the homeowners and people helping the homeowners design a retrofit. You could do a hybrid approach. You could still have a list of rebates for things where the performance-based incentive might not seem to be enough. but combine it with a performance-based one. That's the way the recommendation in this report suggested they improved the Greener Homes program.
Okay, thank you. So unfortunately, I know we're having a wonderful conversation and there are still so many questions in the chat. Kai has left his contact information up on the screen there. If you do have any questions, and Kai, there are a lot of people asking for the slides as well because they're just so impressed with the information that you've provided. So I would just encourage you to reach out to Kai if you have any additional questions. Thank you all for the wonderful questions that you had provided today. We got through only a tiny bit of them. So I can tell how passionate people are about this issue and how impactful it is to many Canadians. So I just want to thank you, Kai, for being here and providing this wonderful presentation and your thoughts on the program, how it could look. I'm hopeful that hopefully some of these suggestions will be integrated into programming, whether it's at the provincial level or the federal level. Thank you for being here. And before we leave, I just wanted to mention to everybody that our next discovery session will be in 2 weeks. So in 2 weeks, we will have our very own Abby Cantanani joining us, and he will talk about energy poverty, the risks and vulnerability using the latest Canadian data set. We also have some mapping that we've done and some profiles that we've done as well of who is suffering from energy poverty in Canada. This session will be posted on YouTube. Probably in about a week's time. I would look for it then. Efficiency Canada has its own Discovery channel as well as its own YouTube channel. If you're interested in seeing that webinar, please go to our YouTube channel in about a week. Thank you for coming. Thank you, Kai. We really appreciate it. And take care, everyone. Have a wonderful weekend.